Clicked.
Beautiful people of the internet, and welcome once more to our spectacular Super Sunday special. Joined as always by the lovely Helen Chorley, who is an international superstar of silver screen and so on and so forth. You've got Mr. Adam Lawrence, portfolio master legendaire. You've got Piotr Ryzanek here, who is our super fundamental and clarity specialist. And you've got me. I'm normally just here talking crap. So, but what we're going to do is we're going to dive straight into the Sunday supplement that no one knows how Adam does it with everything else he does.
No,
but it's a good 3,500 words today, I think.
I can see like a blackboard in front of him. Like I can picture that, and like lots of different numbers and like relationships.
It's like in Minority Report when he just swipes the screens in and he just presses stuff.
I wish it was. John Nash with your piece of chalk and all the calculations.
For the record, I have a television, although a slightly dysfunctional personality as well. So there's pluses and minuses. But as John Nash was the father of game theory, I'll take it because it's pretty good stuff. Pretty good stuff.
Yeah.
What about today? Piotr, what was your takeaway from Adam's discourse on? Oh, you didn't have to go away.
Oh, you frightened him off.
Oh my God! I didn't mean to do that.
That wasn't part of the plan.
Next time I'll just ask him how the weather is in Portugal.
Oh, guys, I clicked something. I have really enjoyed the kind of different parts of how everything works and how actually tax cutting isn't really tax cutting because it's like just putting from one jar to another jar, and like there's more thing in this one because it was raining heavily and stuff. So it's like it was really good to see the relationships between different things, and I like clarity, and there's a lot of clarity in those high level things that Adam covered this week. So
well, Will was actually otherwise engaged this weekend, so Ben Nichols very kindly stepped into the breach to do the audio version with me this morning. And he asked an absolutely fab question. He said, well, this 150 billion that you're referring to in there. So for people who haven't been through the 4,000 odd words yet, what are you playing at? You get up at 6:30. It's there. It's posted. Just because the clocks went forward, there's no excuse for not reading it. OK, but one of the things that it contains in this week is a little summary of the 150 billion extra money that the Chancellor has found down the back of the sofa, purely because last year didn't turn out as badly as the Office of Budgetary Responsibility expected that it might do. So it puts a couple of things into context. What Piotr was saying, there's 11 billion quid's worth of giveaways this week. Not a lot when you've got 150 in the tank. But Ben asked a great question, which was, well, there's a lot of chat from me and other analysts about inflation affecting the pound in people's pocket and all the rest of it. But does the government not suffer from the same set of circumstances? And I thought it would be a good place for us to kick off because the reason why the government doesn't suffer in the same way, of course, is because the government carries a level of debt that most unsecured debt, effectively, that most of us could only ever dream of in terms of percentage of income. In terms of actual nominal value of it. And of course, it owes more than it brings in. And I've said before, the government's the best business model in the world. It really is a spectacular business model. I'd love to have just 1% of that would do me quite nicely. But ultimately, they owe more than they've got. On the balance sheet, they are insolvent, as is every country that carries debt. But of course, they have a fantastic and really quite stable income, even in times of trouble. Yes, tax receipts do tend to go down a fair amount, but not as much as you might think if you look back at, say, 2008, 9, 10. And they've gone up rather spectacularly since then. So lots of debt on paper, lots of income coming in to service that debt. As usual, a lot of fuss being made over the 83 billion in debt payments that we will make this year, as the largest payments we will ever make. But again, it's not being put into real terms context. It's not been adjusted for inflation. We're actually doing far better than we thought we would be in terms of the debt to GDP ratio. So in reality, as we've kind of alluded to a number of times over the past months, the government's quite comfortable with an inflationary situation from an economic point of view because of the amount of money that they owe at a really simple level. They're not comfortable with it because when we start to get above the magic sort of 4%, 4.5%, 5% barrier, it starts to bring other things with it that the government really don't want to be happening. So they've had it off this year, really, so far. Public sector wages are up 3%. That's, as usual, not enough. Keeps the pattern of the last decade or so running. Poor people who work in the public sector, unless you're getting regular promotions, you're feeling the pinch, ultimately. And that's why you have people in public services who are using food banks. Not all of it is because of the poor quality pay. Some of it, of course, is maybe just we're not taught budgetary skills at school, nor are we taught them when we leave school in adult education. So there's individual responsibility and there's collective responsibility. So it's everybody's fault altogether, effectively, is the moral of the story. But yeah, the government relatively comfortable, apart from what's the one thing? It was the Spitting Images best character ever, the grey John Major, that actually coined the feel-good factor phrase, because I looked it up the other day and it was John Major, or perhaps one of his special advisors, more realistically. And that's the problem. You know, Rishi has dished out an income tax cut. It's quite interesting. Piotr was sort of saying about the understanding the different pots and everything that I was trying to put some clarity around today. But it reminds me of the old either find the lady or the old shell and pea game, you know, because there's a little bit of this going on with national insurance has gone up. I'm overall supportive of national insurance going up to tax the people who've got more money a little bit more. Of course, there's a very easy counter argument to that the top 1%, 2%, 3% don't get a lot of their money from income tax. They get it via paying other taxes such as capital gains or dividend tax. Now, dividend tax has been hammered over recent years, so that's probably pretty fair. CGT is the miracle that's been left alone for the moment. And actually now I don't see it being changed before the next election, because the core Conservative base might well get rather hacked off by that. I think it's a dead man walking, but it may well walk on to sort of 2025, maybe something like that. So, but by moving some of the incidents from income tax to national insurance, which is effectively what he's done, what it does is it taxes those who are working. Who pays income tax who doesn't go to work? You might ask yourself. Well, it's something I've been talking about for the last few weeks. Pensioners. If you've got the state pension, and then you've got a pretty modest private pension, you're going to be in the income tax bracket. So you will feel that 1% benefit. Oh, April 2024. That seems to be reasonably good timing. There may be one of those elections, maybe 1, 2, 3 months after that. So fair play to Rishi for being open enough to announce it today. So it's as shameless as it would be if he announced it 3 weeks before the election. But it's the headlines will have been swept under the carpet by then. So he recognises some of the stuff I think that I've been saying around pensioners are in trouble when the triple lock, remember last year, the famous triple lock was sidestepped or put on ice for a year. So pensions are only up 3.1%. They're going to feel the problem when the heating goes back on. Now, not much has been made of it. I didn't actually put it in the supplement, but they're now automating the process for the warm home scheme for people who need a little bit of an extra grant when the heating needs to go on in the winter. And they think that will bring another 1 million people into the scheme. I'm not sure why the Conservative PR machine hasn't made more of a fuss of that, to be honest with you, because the least well-educated will be the ones who have the least access to these sort of things, and they don't understand their rights in terms of their benefits. That will actually cost the government quite a lot of money, and it will pick up something that it needs to. The reality is, I think we'll need to see by the time September comes around and we're getting the red suitcase out again, where are the energy prices going to be at for October? Because you and I said this last winter and we got away without it, you know, we'll still have, I was earwigging the last time I went to a Bank of England presentation there was a professor of epidemiology there, and he was talking about the overall organisation level of the NHS around coronavirus. And basically, he said his view was 2022-23 winter will still be full of stops and starts and people isolating and this, that, and the other, because they're still not ready for the steady state situation yet. They haven't decided, are we getting a shot in the arm just because we're over 60 or 65, optional vaccine just as you get the flu vaccine, but how will the deployment of that work, and what variant will it be supposedly engineered against, you know? And the reality is, from me reading between the lines of what he was saying, they don't know, and they're not going to be prepared for it because they're not agile enough to be able to deploy that effectively this winter. So if you then put in the Daily Express's usual weather forecast for the winter of -63 or whatever they think it'll be, but if that comes to pass as a reality, alongside still a relatively disorganized, disjointed lockdown, alongside energy prices not calming down, or even worse, the oil price continuing to go up and the gas price continuing to go up, then you've got a pretty nasty little cocktail there for Q4 2022. And that's why, one of the reasons why my forecasts say P recession equals 0.5 at the moment, 50-50 chance of a recession in the next 18 months. And I think that's probably and I don't say that to make people bear it, because recessions don't always cripple the property market. They don't always cripple the stock market. They can have some quite perverse effects on both of those things. I say it because, you know, I think people need and want to know. And of course, for those of us who have tenants, then we also need to understand how much exposure, even if property prices go up, if arrears go through the roof, if evictions change, if all of those things that do fall on the back of the recession.
Do you think that obviously, like in the autumn budget, they will cover all those things you mentioned about? Because it's like a bit early to cover everything like right now.
Yeah, it is. And I think the other issue might be they might not be able to wait that long, because one of the things we've learned over the last couple of years is this has changed. Things have changed very quickly. You know, China are now re-examining their zero COVID policy, as I understand it, not before time, because the disruption it will continue to provide to world supply chains is problematic. Now, why are they really doing it? Because we're going to start buying stuff from India, because we're going to start buying stuff from Pakistan, because we're going to start buying stuff from Vietnam, because we're going to start buying stuff from Indonesia, or more than we already are. You know, so business is dictating the CCP's policy, which is quite rare, actually, alongside them trying to still deflate that. You know, Evergreen was in the news significantly for about a few days, wasn't it? A week, maybe, last year. Guess what? It's not sorted. It's still rumbling on. It might remind you, I don't know, Helen, if that reminds you a bit of the headlines around 2007, where things sort of blew up a bit, and then it was kind of like, oh, hold on, the music's still going, everyone's fine, everything's fine, don't worry, you know.
Yeah, those queues outside. I remember being in Edinburgh in 2000, pretty sure it was 2007, and seeing the queues outside the I've forgotten what bank it was.
Northern Rock.
The bank. Yes, thank you. There you go. Yeah, I was meeting some asset managers up there and seeing that and thinking, uh-oh. And then again, it all just patterned up, didn't it? It was just, oh, okay. Yeah, I don't know. You know, I don't know. Some new influencer, you know, you watch what their story is. I'm like, okay, what's the
politician gets caught with his trousers down or whatever? New story. New story. Old story, obviously, but new story. So we've got some. I think we've got some interesting times as we go ahead. And I think, I mean, Piotr, the whole point was he was trying not to make it a budget by not doing. You know, you're not really supposed to make any taxation adjustments. And he's gone after some. It's funny because none of the press has made anything out of. I had to dig really deep to get those numbers that I put in this. We were joking before we were on air, saying I could probably just make stuff up and people believe me at this point, but they are the real numbers from the Office of Budget Responsibility, and it's just been made nothing out of that. Rishi's got, you know, Labour. What are they playing at? Do they not have someone to do some? And I mean, it's not rocket science what I've done. You know, I've just put some work into it and done some analysis. It's not a big deal. So where's their, why are they on Question Time floundering like they were this week? I don't usually watch it, I must say, but I did watch it this week, and it was, the Conservatives had a pretty tough time, given that they were in Reading, and Reading, Thames Valley, reasonably affluent area, nice area. You'd expect a relatively safe Conservative seat. Damien Hines had a pretty tough time, but I just thought, and Lisa Nandy, whilst perhaps not my favourite politician of all time, I think he's one of the better politicians in the Labour Party, and she missed about 7 or 8 open goals, in my view. But the audience was so not anti-conservative per se, but so down on the incumbents. It really made me think what I've said the last few weeks as well. 50p says Labour win the next election at the moment. Whether they're any good or all Starmer's got to not be is as mad and extreme as Corbyn was. So that's what it looks like at the moment. But, a lot changes in 2 years, and whether our great leader is still the one to see us through to the next one, and whether he can pull it out the fire, or whether they even let him try and pull it out the fire, not sure. But I'll be gutted to see Rishi leave 11, I think, because I think I'm not saying he's doing the best for all of the people at the time, but I think his stewardship has been the most sensible that I've ever seen in my lifetime as a Chancellor.
But he's just making way for you, isn't he, Adam?
Whether it'll be enough, I'm not sure. Might have a couple too many skeletons in the closet, Helen, to be honest. That's probably not a subject for today.
I saw an interview with Gordon Brown, and he was doing this whole high and mighty thing. I was like, people haven't forgotten the mistakes you made. He's like 3 links of sausages, isn't he? A tie and a belt in between. God bless him. But it's he sold off the gold reserves, and not at the best possible time. Not like there's a best possible time to sell off gold reserves, but that whole kind of incestuous thing between him and Tony Blair, like, oh, make sure I get in, and if I ever leave, I'll spoon you in. Right? I mean, that's just there's very little democracy in that, in my view. But I thought, well,
you could be like Gove and Johnson, and we'll get Brexit done together, and then who stabs who in the back first? That's
exactly. It was, and to be honest, I wasn't expecting Boris to be able to move so quickly, considering he's got a floundering affectation to himself at the best of times. But yeah, he was quick with that blade. God bless him. But following on from your point of, there's not really the feel good kind of factor that John Major coined. Is I was thinking, obviously not the kind of level that you were thinking, but I was thinking if they were to do away with or do a moratorium for the next 5 to 10 years on the inheritance tax, the death tax. Because it's not really linked to anything, and it allows people to retain, not just to retain wealth, but to actually inherit something without having to sell assets. And it allows people to build a little bit of a war chest. And at the same time, there's a positive to say, look, for the next 10 years, we're putting a moratorium on, or limiting it. If your estate is under £1 million, there's no tax. And if it's over, it's, they could stage it like they have with the stamp duty, for instance.
I think, Jay, I think that's really interesting. I think I'd actually go even a stage further than that. I think one of the phenomena that is poorly understood by central government is aspiration, because it's very easy to write off everyone on benefits as work shy. That's the lazy right-wing press way of dealing with it, right? It's very easy to put people in boxes and say, well, if you had universal basic income, no one will go to work. It's not going to be the case. A good example of that would be, I felt very strongly when they announced Homes for Ukraine and the improved visa process, that we would have no problem in this country with hundreds of thousands of people volunteering. And I asked about 20 people, just a little straw poll, different people in different parts of different moving parts of my life. And none of them were as confident as I was. And then there was this huge, brilliant reaction from at least trying to make sure we can make some of that process work. So people tend to be a little bit and I think central government are the worst of them all, they don't really understand aspirations. So by freezing the inheritance tax threshold for as long as they are very, very close now to dragging in the average house price in the UK being enough to be the inheritance tax threshold. Now, it's not quite as simple as that, because there are a couple of things that they have changed.
Yeah.
But even if you have, let's say you paid the mortgage off, you're 60, you're concerned about care costs, and you'd like to give a bit of money to the kids, and you live in a house that's 230k. There's an average is 250k average UK house price. Yeah, there's no inheritance tax concerns there, especially if you're a married couple. You're nowhere near any inheritance tax concerns, but there's still aspirations that it might be a problem for you. And so you catch everybody who's in the bracket, but also maybe 20 or 30% of the rest of the people who are not in the bracket, who aspire to be there one day, or maybe back to people who are in their 50s and 40s and 30s and 20s who still have the drive to work on. I think, well, one day I'm going to need to solve that problem. And if I get the feeling that the government are looking after me and are being fair around that sort of thing, it will bring not necessarily feel-good factor, but a slightly warmer feeling than the reception that Damien Hines got in Reading on Question Time on Thursday night, which was,
Cold.
One step down from Novichok, I describe it as, realistically.
Yeah, that lady was, she was telling him off like it was her son. And he wanted to say something, but he knew he couldn't, because she was like, "I've voted Conservative my whole life. What you've done is a disgrace. You should be. I'm so disappointed. I'll never vote for you." And but it was done in that kind of there's no answering back.
Yeah.
Yes, it was get some of that, and I thought what. And that's brilliant. I mean, I think we spoke about this fairly recently. Is we had a short bit of commentary on how politicians are speaking and how they're using language, and how actually some of them make no bloody sense whatsoever. They can't string a sentence together. And then you look at like the Bank of England, and they are very good at speaking. They're very good at detailing. They don't give away too much. There's no faux pas. They don't misspeak. And you start to think, well, you've got the Bank of England being run by better politicians than the politicians running the country, essentially, and it's scary.
Really good point. Really good point.
I
think they engineer their press conferences such that they know exactly what they're going to. It's not like they have to face the nation in a sort of Chris Whitty, Patrick Vallance, Boris Johnson triumvirate at 5 p.m. every day, and no one's going to. I saw probably the best question leveled. Did you see the question leveled this week by the Labour politician to the chief exec of P&O, where he basically said, "I've read your autobiography or biography or whatever it is." He said, "Not a lot of mentions of you being a chief exec in there, so I'm just wondering if you're incompetent or just a criminal."
You're either incompetent or a criminal. So which is it?
Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, £1.52 an hour. £1.52 an hour. On average, it's £5.50 an hour for their employees, but some employees are on £1.52 an hour.
Listening to Mark Sawatka on Question Time, who's the head of the PNC union, is like nails down a blackboard. But the extremity of his solutions to what P&O have done was just fascinating, because it's like, nationalise the cruise lines. That's like, okay, it's critical transport infrastructure. No, it's not. That's why they're getting away with paying people £1.50 an hour, apart from anything else. But because it's international, not national. Unbelievable. But it just the thing is, the real point is, they didn't have an answer. It wasn't the government's fault what happened. They don't have an answer to what P&O have done, other than to throw the book at them, which they absolutely will do.
Well, the answer from P&O was, so why didn't you, before you did this, why didn't you speak to the trade unions? Oh, well, we didn't think we were going to give them something that they would agree to. So we just didn't do it.
So he just broke the law. We just
Yeah.
rode roughshod over. But I mean, he said, didn't he, the chief exec, whose name I forget, and I'm sure whose name we'll all forget relatively quickly when he's been consigned to the scrap heap of chief execs. He said something like, well, you know, I know that I broke the law, but I'd do it again. And it's like, well, that really should get you sent to prison, to be honest with you, because that's kind of the point of the law. But their
I
argument
kind
was,
of like that refreshing honesty, though, right?
well, their argument was,
I'm not agreeing with it.
I think they've got themselves into I mean, look, cruise liners haven't had a great time thanks to COVID. There was a couple of big profile, was it the Diamond Princess or whatever, the Japanese ship very early on. And there's been a couple of and really big tin can on water with the coronavirus circuit. It's not ideal. It's not ideal. So most people are going to give it a bit of a wide berth, if you'll pardon the pun.
Unless you're in Malta, they welcome them into Malta. We all have to stay inside, but you can rock up in your cruise ship. That's totally fine.
But what to me, Helen, is inexcusable is that was March 2020. Anyone relatively sensible had a reasonable handle on how long this was going to go on. You know, we had historic precedents. We kind of knew when the vaccine was coming. We not with it, but you know, if you went back and looked at some of my March, April 2020 posts where I got utterly obsessed with COVID, you know, there was a lot of forecasting going on about people are saying it'll be a couple of years. That was the sort of scientific community's general, you know, 18 months to 36 months. That was the spread sort of thing. So why, when they weren't doing anything, could they not have been planning for this event? And then when there was furlough, put people on furlough and advise them they might not be coming back and make these changes in 2021 rather than overnight suddenly do all of this. I mean, they're still having to pay out significant monies, either hush money or redundancy, or, you know, there's multiple NDAs being signed or whatever. I just don't know why they had to go about it the way they had to go about it. I understand if some people have got to go, otherwise you've got to close the business. And because they work in international waters, minimum wage doesn't apply. Yes, it is all a bit sharp, but it's probably not quite as bad as the £1.81 an hour highlights or whatever. Because if people are coming from Goa or wherever, then they're potentially coming from to be seafarers, they might still be better off at £1.81 an hour working for P&O than on 62p a day in a sweatshop making clothes in Bangladesh or whatever, you know. So it's horses for courses, and our numbers don't mean the same as, you know, they don't have to worry about the cost of living in London because they're on a ship, right? And bed and board is provided, right? So I'm not defending that, but P&O, as if they suddenly woke up and decided, you know, well, actually the minimum wage doesn't have to apply to us if we don't get people who aren't domiciled in the UK. That would seem relatively obvious. I just think there's ways and means to do these things. And I agree with you. It's refreshing to be honest, but the real honesty would have been, this is all a bit last minute. We've kind of had a couple of years planning for this and we haven't really done anything about it. And now we've waited for the results to come in that we already knew would be really bad. And then we said, right, we're going to have to close the business. It's just a spineless or disorganized way to go about it, you know. And it's easy to say from the outside, but I know from what I was doing in my businesses in March and April 2020, I was forecasting what might happen, what might have to happen. I was having genuinely straight conversations with people to say, look, this is where we're at. This is what's going to happen.
Yeah. And,
you know, but what I was also saying was, we'll keep you on furlough as long as we can, because the cost of doing that, whilst it's something, is I just want to make sure you're going to be okay after it. And that's what I would have done if I was the chief executive P&O, I'm afraid. So
managing expectations, it's the more human, kind of compassionate thing to do, isn't it? But as we know, a lot of these people are sociopathic. So,
well, you know, there's just been the big Solihull news, which I'm sure everyone will have heard this week, is that the bin strike has been postponed. So they've managed to do a deal at the last minute. But there's been a pretty famous example of this sort of difference of mentality over the years, because Solihull years ago outsourced their bin collection stuff to Amy, or I think it's going over to Veolia now or whatever. Whereas Birmingham kept their unionised, rather well-paid refuse operatives. So there was the line between the two. Anyone who lives in Solihull will be keen to tell you. You know, if if you live above the salt, darling, then you're reasonably well to do. But that was actually reversed for the refuse collectors because they were on a much better deal if they worked in Birmingham. And the thing is, you get into these situations where Amy have got an absolute raft of people willing to do it for £10 an hour, rightly or wrongly, they have. Whereas in Birmingham, it was more like you're on nearly 50 grand a year if you drive the truck. And it's, what is it? Probably a 35-hour-a-week commitment, maybe, sometimes a bit quicker. Yes, you start early, but you certainly tend to finish pretty early. And I'm not saying refuse operatives shouldn't get paid. You know, they're important. They're arguably more important than hedge fund traders sometimes. But still, if the market dictates where the money's at and where the skill level is at, it is what it is. Uncle Milton would not have us interfering with the market in these situations. And that kind of segues into what I was saying near the end, which is Rishi has been, I think, one of the cleverest things. And I admire cleverness, whether it's in, you know, a drug cartel or whether it's in the government cartel. Whether it be right or wrong, I'll leave to one side. But it's very clever to push sort of £500 million to the local authority hardship funds to say, right, okay, there's that money. You guys allocate it to the people who need it the most. Because when you don't necessarily means test things, you know, you've got food banks open to, as far as I'm aware, if you go to a food bank, they're not asking for proof of income or proof of lack of income. You know, you get in the queue, you get something. So there are some people who don't budget who are going to food banks. There are some people who can't make it to food banks because they're infirm or they haven't got anyone to help them out. So they don't necessarily clear the market as you might like. So Rishi said, well, okay, Mr. Local Authority, there you go. You go and sort out the laser focused specifics. Now, we all know that just won't happen. There'll be too much bureaucracy. There'll be too much inefficiency. It's too hard for the local authority to identify those genuine cases as well. But Rishi gets to do it at probably somewhere between 10 and 20% of the cost, and then pass the buck down to the LA and say, well, look, you guys are supposed to be sorted. You've still got 32 million in your hardship fund. So why haven't you deployed it? And it's very clever. But really, if you are in the bottom 20% of income earners, you don't really want the lower skilled politicians, in the nicest possible way, being the ones to be allocating the resources. So it's a very macro micro argument. The Milton Friedman in me thinks it's genius, realistically. The compassionate human being in me thinks, yeah, at what cost, you know? Yeah. But it is the Conservative Party. What do you expect? Well,
it's interesting because you know, a lot of departments within a lot of local authorities throughout the country are still massively behind. You hear things about planning applications, basic planning applications,
prime example, yeah,
18 months. You know, you still can't get a local authority search in Hackney. For love nor money, you can't get a local authority search in Hackney.
Wow.
You know, so passing the buck down to these the smaller kind of bureaucrats within the ecosystem, it's probably going to be it's like you say, red tape and bureaucracy. It's not going to go anywhere fast because they haven't got the mechanisms to means test it, which each local authority, I imagine, will have their own parlance on that. It just looks like another clusterfuck waiting to happen.
Great. And the thing is, there is a bit of, you know, there is some of the frustration I saw with Rishi on social media this week, and when you understand that 150 billion versus 11 billion given back, when 12 billion is going on the tax bill next month anyway, some of the frustration is around that. But I do think there is also a lot of, you know what, let's see what happens, because last March, you know, these really bearish forecasts that led to all this now extra money that there is in the tank, you know, if you were a little bit fleeter of foot, let's say, possibly producing some reasonable economic analysis on a Sunday morning on a weekly basis, then you would look back and see that I was predicting things were nowhere near as bad as they were saying they were going to be. And so it came to pass, and there ended the lesson. But So it came to pass. Now what I'm predicting is it might be a little bit worse than they're predicting currently. So we flip-flopped, right? They've caught up. They're still a bit slow. They're too bullish on GDP growth this year. So the same conversation is going to be had, maybe, as Piotr was saying, around the time of the proper budget when we get there to the autumn. maybe before that. Not sure. Maybe, the frustration of people who look at holiday prices, and because oil is where it is, they're suddenly, 50% more expensive or 100% more expensive than they were 3 months ago. Unbelievably. And most people haven't been in of the gambling mindset to say, well, it'll probably be okay, so book a holiday in January. They didn't do it that way. They waited to see what the requirements were going to be, and understandably. So there is, I do sympathise with not sort of knee jerking every 5 minutes, but I think there's some of this stuff is relatively, there's been some things like inflation being where it is today or somewhere above target, let's say. To my mind, last year was getting towards a 100% certainty very, very early on. And a lot of things weren't done because people thought, well, a little bit of inflation, that'll be nice. We'll inflate away a bit of that debt, as we were saying earlier. Exactly. Jolly good. But yeah, going back to what you were saying, Jay, there doesn't seem to have been, I think probably the LAs, I don't know if anybody knows anybody who is at a senior level in local authorities who has to recruit. But I'd imagine they're having probably the toughest recruitment problems of anybody because, the wages are pretty poor anyway. They're not going up at the same rate as the private. They're going up at half the rate of the private sector. It's difficult to attract talent into those jobs at the best of times, which is part of the problem. So where are they going to get the next planning officer from, or where are they going to get the next XYZ from? How do they even have apprenticeship schemes? Do they practice what they preach and have apprenticeship schemes? I don't know, but I've never seen them advertised. I've never seen anyone putting anything on the radio about coming to work for the local authority.
Well, the reason for that is most of that the local level stuff is they employ from within, so they give existing employees a chance to. It's like a banded system. So if you're a band 3, you can go across to another band 3 in a different department, or you can apply to go to a band 4, but you can't jump from band 3 to band 6. And it's normally marketed internally about 6 to 9 months before they do any external marketing. So it's a very, very slow process.
Wow.
It's a very slow process. They don't really deal with recruiters. They tend to advertise. Sometimes you'll see it in the Estates Gazette, especially if it's like an estate manager or a planning. You'll see the property specific ones there. And I imagine if it's engineering, you'll see it in an engineering magazine, or if it, for whatever it may be. But the kickoff is normally a good 6 to 9 months internal.
Wow. They're just
I applied for a government position about 15 years ago, and it was a 2-year application. It was a 24-month application.
I do not understand anyone who applies for positions like that, because it's I never since uni never applied for any sort of banking roles or anything like that, because going through 3 or 4 or 5 stage process is just a nightmare. I would rather focus on the business.
How could you be in position to do that, Jay, unless you were a first-year university student or something?
No, I was in my final year of law school, the 3rd degree. I was in the final year of law school when I started it, because basically it was almost like a James Bond kind of position. It was with one of the MIs. So it was a long old process, and I passed the intelligence, the IQ test. I passed the psychology. I passed all of those tests. And the position I was going for, there's only 3 people in the country that hold the position. And the person who beat me is, I assume is or was, an autistic savant who could tell you the date, name, address, anything and would retain information. I mean, I'm good, but unbelievable.
Listen, Jay, I'm now convinced that you actually got the job, and you're telling us this to convince everybody you didn't get the job.
That's it. It's the greatest.
I'm calling
trick
you
the
out
devil
live
ever,
on air.
The greatest trick the devil ever played was convincing everyone he didn't exist. Yeah, this is some reversal of the reverse psychology. But no,
MI7 hashtag Jay Howard. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I made it all the way to the final interview.
Wow.
Yeah.
Fantastic experience.
There was basically a training day or an assessment or an interview every 6 months. So they kind of tested your performance over, and they track and all that kind of stuff.
To be fair, it sounds very like my assessment criteria for developers. So I'm fully in favour.
I can feel a rebrand coming on, Helen. MI6.
MI Chorley.
So you just have to. You can call yourself H, just like Q and M, can't you? Although, if you watch Line of Duty, that might be a problem. Maybe you just call yourself C instead. Maybe C is.
Wow.
Nice one.
I think Scott would make a great quartermaster. Actually, I can imagine him providing the weaponry required for a good development.
Oh yeah.
I think he'd really enjoy that. Here's something that explodes.
Open the doors on the shed, and it would be all sorts of laser measures and the odd grenade in case you needed it or something, you know.
Oh my god, that'd be amazing.
How to deal with a difficult neighbour, that sort of play.
Oh god, if you can send me that book, I live right next to a bunch of arseholes. It's unbelievable. Doesn't matter how nice I can be to some people. Some people just don't want niceties. The guy walks around with a face like a smacked ass 24/7. It's depressing even looking at him sometimes, but that's my rant over. Apologies.
Are you asking me to come over and have a chat with them?
Yes, come over. Yeah. At the moment, my cousin who lives a couple of roads away, he was a semi-professional MMA fighter. And him and the next door neighbor had an altercation, and basically the neighbor behaved for 6 months. So I might just invite Russell round for a cup of tea this afternoon, wind his neck in. Life could be so much simpler if everyone wasn't such a bottom feeder for certain.
Couldn't it just? But then that comes back to the who do you want to blame for a lot of this stuff? That's the problem. That is the problem. And even if it isn't your fault, you better take responsibility for getting out of it, even if it wasn't your fault for getting into it. Because no one else
takes us back to our responsibility ownership conversation.
Yeah.
So 100% agree. Yeah, whether it's you or it's not you, you take your load, you take your share.
Yep.
This is what's going to come. It'll come into play from an economic perspective over the next 12 months in a really big way. Because I can visualize if I worked in the LA department handing out the hardship fund, and someone comes in with a bank statement that says they went to Just Eat 6 times last week or whatever, my sympathy would be limited. I'm going to be honest with you. I'm not sure they'd have me on the front line tough love department. I'm not sure that would be that would maybe not be the work coach that they're looking for, but just try Rod if you think I'm harsh. That's all I can say.
Could be the Chancellor of Cuddles.
Yeah. The professional huggers are over there. Yeah. This is not the professional hugging department.
Your point about the 50 pence on Labour coming in. I mean, I'm far less concerned about that as I was when Starling Corbyn was in the driving seat. But I mean, my concern with this one, I say this one with Mr. Starmer is that he appears very much to me to be a bit of a Captain Hindsight. It's ultra reactionary, and I think there's maybe a little bit too much pain in being too gung ho and too actionary, and we've seen that with the likes of Johnson and Trump and things like that. But too reactionary puts you too far behind the curve, and I would foresee more troubles than resolutions.
I think it's a good. I think that's a really balanced viewpoint. To be honest, I think you don't want to swallow the sort of press line around this, that, and the other. I have quite high hopes for Starmer, in the hope that we would finally restore a situation where we had a strong opposition. That's really at least where I want it to be, and for it to be a decent competition. Whereas what I knew of him when he was the DPP and what I'd seen of him beforehand, really robust debater, fair man, fair-minded man, lots to like about him. And then what we ended up with, it seems, is a bit of a lily-livered, didn't even have the balls to sweep the broom clean when 70% of the country said, not Corbyn, thank you. That means not the people who are behind Corbyn with some of these absolutely ridiculous communist policies, ultimately, including the confiscation of private property. And that's not an overstatement of where Corbyn was at. Right? That is a fact. So, obviously, I was vehemently against that. But I agree with you, especially with the way, the pace at which things have moved. I mean, I'm criticising the Chancellor and the Central Bank, ultimately, for probably sitting back a little too much. Central Bank, not so much, because I don't think there's much they can do, unfortunately. But then if I was getting paid 500 grand a year to be the governor of the Bank of England, I couldn't come out and say that, could I? But I don't think there's that much they can. Within their remit, there's not that much they can do, apart from prepare for what they're going to do when one of the number of possible scenarios plays out. But yeah, to go even slower than Rishi and Boris would be relatively disastrous at this time, I think. I mean, Boris, I get the impression of Boris that he's just like a bulldog that you have to keep on a lead, because he wakes up and just wants to spend money on, just like a small child points at it and wants to buy it. You know what I mean? So like, I visualize Rishi regularly slapping him and saying, we're not doing that. We haven't got the money to do that. Don't do that. We're not doing that. But, to go on to I couldn't believe he kept Annalise Dodds as the John McDonnell light version. It started things off in a horrific way. So he lost that, they say when you go into a new job, especially in a senior role, you've got the first 90 days, right? People aren't expecting you to pull up trees. You can't deliver results in 90 days. But what you can do is you can make an impression and make people believe in you. You've got those 90 days to get everyone around you. And his 90 days are just an utter damp squib. Aside from announcing what needed to be done around the anti-Semitism stuff, I don't remember a single thing that he did. He didn't clear the dead wood out at all. He got rid of a few people, and it's taken him 2 and a bit years to clear out a few of the other Corbynistas that needed clearing out, to bring the party back to the centre, to make it electable again. If you're on the hard left, you're not going to like that sort of chap. But ultimately, you find your home there anyway, because you're not going to go with anything else, very likely. But what it needs is the people from the centre. There's a good 20% in the middle that could go left or right. And what I heard in the Question Time audience on Thursday night, I felt, was that 20% was definitely leaning away from. I mean, let's not forget, right? Why did Boris win? Right? If you went to Boris's memoirs, it'll say because he was such a wonderful orator and a brilliant politician and all that. But of those people who lent the vote, so you were talking about earlier, Jay, plenty of them were not for the other guy, right? Yes. Not for the other guy. So you've got to take out. And now he is in position right now such that he could be the other guy that people won't vote for because they think he's reprehensible, because they think he thinks he's above the law, which, spoiler alert, he definitely thinks that he is. Because of all of these reasons, he thinks he's a superhuman being. Putin's getting criticised for wanting to be like Peter the Great. And it's like, let's not forget that Boris thinks he's Alexander the Great, right? So let's just bear that in mind. He's got every bit as a dysfunctional a personality. He's just got more shackles around him that keep him honest. That's the bottom line. And honest he is not, let's face it. But he could be the other guy who people will vote for the other side for if Starmer or other warm body. David Miliband gets dragged out of the ocean or whatever, someone should be able to stand up and beat this guy at this point. But I don't know if Starmer has got the wherewithal to do it, really.
Well,
and
maybe Starmer's kind of approach is, maybe I'll just let him do all this crap and then pull him over the coals afterwards. Maybe that's why he appears reactionary. Maybe it's like, I'm not going to get involved in but that's still too passive to be running a country. But he's kind of like, I think he's just kind of letting him run loose and show people that he is the bad guy. So then Starmer becomes the lesser of the two evils.
Yeah, I think I would be, if I was the leader of the Labour Party, I would be sitting there thinking, no, don't get rid of Boris. That's all right. You just, come on, Boris, just keep doing what you're doing. It's all fine. I'd be really nice to him in Prime Minister's question times, say it's an excellent job, great leader. Yeah, absolutely. But like I said, I think I haven't looked at the betting market for a few weeks, but I'd imagine the favourite is still Hung Parliament. But then it usually is, because people don't know where the floating voters are going to end up. Whereas the real favourite is that there will be an outright winner, despite the follies of our system. And it's not only the people who lent their vote from the infamous Red Wall or whatever, which has kind of been crushed, because if you took a Brexit or Remain position, it just carved all that in half anyway, generally speaking. It still seems that it's not only those who lent their votes in the first place bringing them back, it's other floating voters who lent their votes that can go the other way quite easily.
I would argue voting age up until 30, you can almost guarantee at least 80% of those voting Labour. Almost guarantee it.
There's some pretty good breakdowns of stats in YouGov polls and things like that are not far off that sort of number, and that's why quite a lot of people who are students and things who lived in a bit of a bubble were absolutely convinced Corbyn was going to get in, whereas those of us around, let's say, 40 plus or minus 10 years, household to run, sitting there thinking, person who wants to take away and destroy parts of the capitalist system and be quite anti-democratic in the way in which he does it. Would I fancy that? No, not sure I do. And I'm sure there were plenty of people who had that internal discussion, and there were people who I never thought would vote Conservative in, again, one of my famous little straw polls, and people who were in their 70s who'd never voted Conservative before, who were in absolutely no doubt that, and it always went that way as well. It wasn't, Boris is the man. It was, can't be Corbyn. Can't be Corbyn. CBC, can't be Corbyn. Now, if you don't get that sort of feeling, if you do get that sort of feeling from Boris, because the country hasn't forgiven him, but he is quite a charmer, isn't he? He's the old naughty schoolboy approach. I think, just give me one more chance. I've been, married 17 times, I've got 42 kids or whatever, but that's all behind me, and now it's all fine. I don't think like that anymore. If anybody could do it, he could do it, because he is a bit of a lovable rogue, isn't he, to an extent? But there's a lot of people saying they'll never vote for him again, but it's too early. I don't believe them at this stage necessarily. But it doesn't take. I don't know what the firepower behind. I mean, I look at, and maybe because I'd fancy myself as one of the backroom boys if I was ever involved, but I look at the engine room behind Tony Blair. And, Alistair Campbell's a brilliant man. I don't agree with quite a lot of the stuff that he says sometimes, but I'd love to have a debate with him. Peter Mandelson, a horrific example of humanity, but a genius when it comes to the spin doctoring. Dominic Cummings, but what did these people achieve, and what strings did they pull? And there are other examples of those sorts. So I don't know who the oppos are in the Labour Party at the moment, but I'm not impressed by them. I'll tell you that for free. They're really, really underwhelming, because they should be making Starmer's job easy at the moment, and they're not. They're not. They have missed. For example, they have made a bit this week of them not doing a windfall tax, but they've made, again, they've missed the points that they could have made. When they do it in the old school left wing way, which makes a lot of people who would be, again, it comes back to my point about people being aspirational. And they think, well, actually, I'd like a country where if I ever did get to be well off, let's say, I wouldn't be penalised for that ridiculously. And the way Labour come across is to say, if you do really well, we will super tax you, right? Whereas what they should have done is said, what did George Osborne, much as I feel like spitting every time I say the man's name, what did George Osborne do in 2017, right? He levied a windfall tax, right? Was that clever? Well, yeah, it was quite clever, actually. Did they get away with it? Yes, they did. So Rishi has missed an opportunity, but so have the Labour Party to point out previous Conservative chancellors in the last administration did a windfall tax. You've missed out. You're costing the company 25 billion or whatever you think it could raise, 50 billion, some have said, right? It's not going to affect how much Shell or anybody invests in renewables because they've got to invest in renewables. Giving them a VAT break anyway now, which means they can charge more for what they're doing if they're involved in supply of renewables, which they bloody should be. So where's the excuse for not doing it? It's just why he hasn't done it is the 1922 committee. I mean, I can tell you that for free. But if you're in the opposition, you should be pointing that out. And you should be saying, why have you make him answer the question? Why have you not done it? It was good enough for George Osborne. Why is it not good enough for you? Haven't heard it mentioned, really weak. And
they're focusing on the same old tropes, aren't they? Well, not the same old tropes, but they're focusing on the things that they think are quite popularist. Right? And the popularist is doesn't matter about all these big companies. You're taking £20 a week away from people on universal credit, or they're doing the things that they know are going to be big headline runners. So, and they're doing that at the cost of being blind to everything else that's going on around them.
But mate, 3.9% of the population are currently unemployed. 500,000 people are currently out between 18 and 67 and outside of the labour market by choice, right? Some of which has been, this is the circumstance of the pandemic. But you're going after a smaller and smaller street. So take my point about aspirations, and then just look at the maths. You're going after a smaller and smaller and smaller sector of people as you stick with the old definition of poverty, which grinds my gears, which is you're more than 40% away from the median, right? Now, obviously that does talk about distribution, right? But the problem that people have is you're then talking about poverty when people have mobile phones and Netflix and a roof over their head, and they do have
TV.
And they do have all of those things, and of course there are people who are worse off than that at the tail end of the distribution. Of course there are, but trying a catch-all definition, trying to say, I remember Corbyn saying at some point, there's 4 or 5 or 7 million, I can't remember the number, households in poverty in the UK, and I just thought, I've got a pretty good idea, more than 99% of the population of areas that are not as salubrious, right? What those tenants do, what they earn, what they can afford, how they live, all of those things. And I'm quite objective to the point of, pain, really. I'm painfully fair. I very much try and be painfully fair. And I see 70% of the time the problem being the individual not wanting to take accountability, and 30% of the time a system that's let them down badly. And unfortunately, only if the 70% is addressed can it help them. And sometimes it is addressed, and that's the most fulfilling thing to see in the world. And that's what I'm going full Peterson again. I can't, we're heading, the good ship Peterson is sailing towards it, but the sad reality of life is no one will do it for them. And when they then want to blame X, Y, and Z, it's kind of like, well, yeah, but what about the new sofa that you put on Facebook that you got from Bright House and are paying 58.9% APR? Do you know what 58.9% APR means? No. Okay, well.
That reminds me of that reminds me of a certain developer that was crying poverty whilst owing zillions, still does actually, and then had furnished her new rental property with 20k, but she'd done it all for 20k. I'm like, oh my god, maybe you could have given that 20k back to somebody who you owe.
She didn't. She didn't get a wallpaper from John Lewis like Boris did she? Or she didn't have a donor to do it for. Well, I did slide in a little knife in the supplement this week when the 17 billion of that 150 billion that's been found down the back of the sofa has come from not paying bad debt guarantees to the CBILS loans. So they've actually paid nearly nothing. That won't make any headlines because people want to jump on it when they fail, not when they succeed. But it did remind me of a certain well-known property guru who may or may not have the same name as the popular brand of gentleman's clothing. And when he said, just take out the loans and hang the consequences sort of thing, that doesn't seem to have been the way that it's gone. But I do recognise that if my 50-50 recession coin lands on tails, then you'll see some guarantees redeemed then, I'd say, and then the papers will absolutely explode. But for the moment, things haven't gone too badly.
And here's an interesting question from someone. It's on a slightly different topic. There's been some good interactions there. But Dominic Arnold is asking, he just took on a £1.9 million house on the southeast coast and very concerned about what energy to invest in. Electric boilers, solar, ground source. We've covered this a little bit in the previous ones. But I thought it was just
fantastic question. I think my knowledge from doing my own build that I'm lucky enough to have a detached house, air source heat pump running wet underfloor heating is a fantastic solution and very, very and you've got your £5,000 towards your ASHP as well from the government. Works really well. Works super well if you've got a well-insulated property. So I think you start from the point of view of insulation. So ideally internal. If it was 1.9 million quid, even in the southeast on the coast, it's still going to be pretty nice and big. So you could probably afford to lose a bit off the internal walls. I probably prefer internal to external. But if the outside appearance of that, price-wise, it's maybe half to a third of the price. But if the externals don't look very good, it's also quite a good way to zhuzh up a property, change the render or whatever, depending on what it looks like from the outside by doing EWI. So we actually had a property, it was about 2,200 square foot, that it was actually cheaper. The render was just terribly done and it looked awful. And the EPC was quite low, 1900s build. So EWI was a much better solution than trying to hack off the render or re-render the outside. And we got the energy performance up in the same way. It was about the same money, the EWI, as if we'd re-rendered it, because it's such a terrible job on quite a broad building. So I would definitely look at that. Solar PV is an utter no-brainer at the moment. Before the PV panel prices go up, get your PV in, get 4 kilowatts of PV in there without a doubt. Obviously, I'm an advocate of the electric car, Dominic, if you've not heard that before, but it will help with charging the car as well, which at the moment saves you about 50 grand a year on fuel, which is ideal. And what else have we got? Electric boilers. I've got an electric boiler. They're much maligned, but they're actually quite a bit better now than they used to be. It's got a little air source heat pump on the top of it. Generally speaking, it doesn't need to use the ASHP to run the system. Gets up to temperature, no problem. And again, if you've got PV panels, it can run off the PV panels in the day to heat the water. So you're looking at, your average household gas bill is about 50-50 heating and hot water. For 6 months a year, maybe 7 months a year, you can pretty much zero your hot water bill with an electric boiler and a good set of programming. So that's worth investing in as well, I think. And if you've got a huge amount of grounds with that nice nearly 2 million quid house, then a ground source heat pump's worth looking into as well, really. But it does take up an awful lot of space. So it depends on what landscaping you're planning to do, because it's not a cheap endeavour. But if you're going to redo the garden, it's a bit of a no-brainer. So nice. I'd look into all of those. But get your insulation sorted as the first port of call. Get your insulation strategy sorted first port of call.
That is a proper masterclass in energy efficiency.
If
well, and actually, We did discuss it a couple of weeks ago, so it's probably worth checking out this session from 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago.
2 3 weeks ago, yeah.
So I
Just a
think
quick
Dominic
question.
is watching on YouTube. So
go on, Piotr.
yeah, I'm saying Dominic is watching on YouTube on Property Sisters, so you can like find the videos and in the previous one. By the way, Dominic, what are you doing on Property Sisters?
I had to tell you, Ruth's looked at this. Something like between 70 and 80% of our viewers on I don't know how she can tell on Property Sisters are men.
There we go.
We have a strongly male audience.
So, Jay, what you were saying?
I was just going to ask the question: if the property is on the coast, and normally I take that to mean it's actually sea facing, would the external wall insulation be affected by that? Because normally, if you're sea facing, you've got the salt water, you've got material degradation and things like that. Do you need a specific type of external wall insulation that can battle that?
Now, that is a great question. And of course, they usually use quite a lot of lime render solutions and things like that.
Yeah.
Your problem would be, obviously, you're using a relatively tight coat of render. But remember, what's below it is only Kingspan or other brands are available. 100, 150 mil, 250 mil maybe, styrofoam effectively, or aerofoam. So you would still be able to do the mix accordingly over the top. It's a very tight coat, isn't it? It's only about 8 millimeters, is it, or something that's very, very tight, the coat they put over the top. So it would have to be borne in mind. And I think you're always going to have, but it's going to help. The thing is, what the key with coastal properties, and you're very right to mention that, so I definitely did miss that point, is actually airflow throughout the house. So if you were able to get it up to EPC-A, and that's a big if, and that might be 150 grand's worth of work, so it might just not be viable. But if you were to, I would highly recommend some kind of mechanical ventilation system as well, because it gets the airflow through the house that will stop that coastal damp from building up in any big and old, quite often by the coast, some of these properties are hundreds of years old.
Yeah.
And if you don't, even if you just change perhaps it was owned by a couple of empty nesters who sold up and Dominic's moving in with 5 kids or whatever, all of that extra moisture, all of that extra air needs somewhere to go. You'll find the older the house, the more of the cold spots you'll have, and the more you need to take some. So either at the very lowest level, one of those positive PIV systems, positive input ventilation systems, like a New Air or an EnviroVent, or again, other brands are available. That
draws ones you've invested in, Adam.
That draws cold air from. I declare no conflicts of interest, Mr. Howard. That draws the cold air from the loft space and it keeps it moving around the house. Very low cost to run. Very, very good things. With a big house like that, you might need more than one of them, which is fair enough. If the loft has already been converted, you're going to need a slightly different kind of solution. But there are now versions for flats, for property without lofts, that you can also use. That would be at the bottom end of the solution. The top end would be go full hammer mechanical ventilation, heat recovery, which is spectacular if you've got your air tightness really, really sewn up. And I mean, you're talking 1 cubic meter per second per hectare per picometer or whatever. I can't remember what the unit is, but it's quite complicated. But you need to be pretty much airtight for them to work effectively. You need to be well above current building regulation standards for them to work effectively. So you're looking at the U values of your walls, you're looking at the U values of your windows as obviously the major heat loss sources. And windows might be a problem because there might be sash windows, there might be things to bear in mind. You need to, every property looked out its merits. But if Dominic wants to send me a message, I can hook him up with the guys that I used who did my sustainability consultancy on my build, and they were spectacular and not incredibly expensive either for what they did. So I'm happy to, Dominic, if you're still watching, if you send me a LinkedIn message or whatever, then I'll do you an intro to those guys if you like.
As somebody living in a coastal property, I might get you to send that number to my landlord too.
No problem.
Oh, dear.
Nice
Don't get
one.
me
Cool.
started
Good
on the
stuff, guys.
inefficiency of
I
most of
think we need to wrap up. I need to shoot, and let's come back to this those conversations and questions maybe after the chat or next week in our weekly chat. And yeah, anything to say before we wrap up?
I think there's a few other good comments here, but I'll just pop some stuff in the chat about. I think I've probably done my 87.6% contractual effort today, Piotr. So
I think we're covered. Yeah.
thanks to the patience of the assembled company, I say, for letting me speak so much.
No, it's really good. It's really good. Great inputs, and yeah, speak to you guys next week.
See you
Thank
next
you,
Take care.
week.